Homeschooling veteran and author Phyllis Wheeler.
And homeschooling mom, Sarah Boble, are here today to prepare you for your next trip to the library or to your computer where you can reserve books to pick up at the library if you live where we do. So today we're going to talk about The Remarkable Journey of Coyote Sunrise by Dan Gemeinhart. And we will also get to talk to the author briefly about it afterwards. So stay tuned for that. Phyllis is going to be doing most of the review because I haven't finished the book yet. So Phyllis, can you just give a little summary of what the book is about before we start?
Yeah, this is a book about a girl and her dad who are living in a school bus that's been converted, and it's sort of an RV, and they're just kind of bumming around all over the U.S. They have a carefree life, very little in the way of connections, like no close friends or anything like that, but they're just on the move and they have enough money to eat and do whatever they want to do. And so it's kind of a surreal sort of a life, really. And so as you get into it, you realize that they are fleeing something.
Mm.
So, and that something is grief. Um, Coyote and the girl's name, her new name is Coyote, and her dad's new name is Rodeo. Uh, are well, her dad especially is trying to just leave behind his memories of his wife and other two daughters who died in a car accident. So 5 years before. So Coyote gets a phone call from her grandma, her normal weekly phone call, and grandma mentions casually that the park down the street is going to be dug up in 4 days. So Coyote panics because she remembers very vividly that she and her mom and her two sisters buried a time capsule full of letters to each other, unopened letters, uh, in this park. And it's about to be, these memories are about to be obliterated. So, what to do? Here's the problem. Coyote knows she can't simply say to her dad, hey, let's go back home for a little while because of this, because she knows he won't do it. So she does some scheming and manipulating to get him to drive that way. They've started out in Florida.
Mm.
So this is kind of a madcap journey from Florida up to Washington State with a bunch of other people who they pick up or who they assist. And yeah, it's pretty memorable. What's really most memorable is the character of this young girl. She's supposedly 12, but she feels older than that to me. And she's got this really terrible, hard choice about does she deceive her father or not?
Mm.
And so, uh, all in all, I thought I gave it a 4. There's a
Okay.
lot of good things about this book,
Mhm.
but the deceiving, manipulating part made me a little uncomfortable.
Okay. So the setup sounds like there is lots of room for this to be a good story with, good action points. So I'm assuming good story test. Did it pass?
Yes, it did. Uh-huh. And the characters are vivid, believable, and memorable also.
So what were some of the themes that came through in the book?
Well, mainly it's processing grief. That's what this book is about.
Mm.
What do you do with your grief?
Okay.
Do you run away from it? Do you talk about the people that you remember, or do you try to not talk about them?
Uh-huh.
Do you Do you go to the places you lived with them, or do you avoid them?
Mm.
That is the main thing. Um, yeah.
Do you feel like the author did a good job of capturing what it feels like to be the main character, the person kind of struggling, or one of the people, I guess, struggling through this?
Yeah, I'd say he did. She's a, uh, she's one of these um, kind of smart female middle grade protagonists in the first
Mm.
person. There are others. It's kind of a type in this genre, and yeah, I think he did a good job of nailing this
Mm.
particular girl. I do.
Um, Anything potentially controversial for homeschoolers come up in this book? I mean, you mentioned the deception and
Yeah, and she does break some rules, as she's going through her what do you call it, difficulties trying to get to Washington.
Mhm.
There is a gay character, um, and what else? Uh, oh, there's one mention of violence, family violence. There's a kid there whose father had been hitting the mother.
Mhm.
So this is really not a book for younger middle grade.
Okay. Do you think in the book did she reap some of the consequences of the manipulation and deception, or did it just kind of pass over as like ends justify the means?
Well, she's prepared to. She knows full well that well, except that she's a kid. There's one thing she did that probably would put her in jail for at least for a little while. But being a kid, so yeah, I think her inner monologue, she's not shrugging it off. She
Yeah.
realizes there are consequences, which it
Okay.
did not, in fact, materialize. But
Yeah.
that's anyway.
Okay. Any either specific or general likes and dislikes?
Well, I really like this idea of traveling the U.S. in an old school bus, and here's why: because I did it when I was a kid. My family had an old school bus that my dad bought after it had been converted, and then we took trips from Texas to Washington State to see our grandparents
Oh,
in
cool.
it. So this really struck a big chord with me. Now our school bus had a bathroom in it, and hers didn't. So I guess ours is better.
Yeah. That's a big selling point.
So beyond that, yeah, I do kind of enjoy these spunky kid books,
Yeah.
and this is one, and I did enjoy it.
Yeah. Cool. So, and you mentioned probably for older middle grade audience because of
Yeah, I would say, yeah, definitely 12 to 14 or 10 to 14. I don't know. Anyway, not the younger kids, unless you
yeah.
really want to sit down and, read the book with them and discuss some of this stuff. Like, it kind of merits discussion, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we started reading a book called Shiloh. Have you heard of it? About the boy who wants this dog named Shiloh, and he has to go through a whole lot of deception and lies. And he also carries an inner monologue about the repercussions of this deception, of this lying, and how it spreads. So far, like none of it has come to, bite him in the butt yet, but
Yeah.
it tears him up on the inside. So it's really interesting to have an author do that, like not just have the kid out there for their own selfish gain all the time, but really struggling with whether what's right and what's wrong and where gray areas are because we know that they exist. So cool. Okay, so we will talk to Dan here shortly when he hops on.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us. This is Dan Gemeinhart. Am I saying it right?
That's perfectly right. Exactly.
Okay. Yes, we talked to Daniel Nayeri a few weeks ago, and we said we're gonna do the remarkable journey of Coyote Sunrise. I keep wanting to say Coyote Ugly because of the movie, but and he said, "Oh yeah, Dan Gemeinhart, he's great." And I was like, "Oh, that's how you say it. Perfect." So,
Nice. Oh,
so
oh wonderful.
he helped us out.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'm excited to be here to chat with you guys.
So where do you live?
I live in Washington State, and not like Seattle. We live in a little town up in the mountains, so like 3 hours away from Seattle. So rural, small town, north central Washington State.
Oh, that sounds really nice.
Awesome.
We lived in Bellingham for a little while and enjoyed that area a lot.
Oh, nice. Yeah, totally.
So how did you get the idea for this book, Dan?
So Coyote Sunrise, really it all came out of a terrible daydream that I had one night. And so there's a family in the story that before some tragic backstory happens was a mom and a dad and 3 daughters living in a small town in Washington State. And that is kind of based on my own family, who's thankfully all still alive, spoiler alert. But it's me and my wife and our 3 daughters living in a small town in Washington State. And one night, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I was home alone with my middle daughter. My wife and the other 2 were out running errands or something. And I had this horrible daydream, this horrible thought, like what would happen to me and my daughter if something happened to them on the way home and they never made it home? What would that do to us? How would we survive that? How would we move forward? How would we stay together as a little family after suffering a loss like that? And I thought, oh, well, we couldn't stay in this house or this town with all these memories. It'd be so sad. So we'd want to leave, but there's nowhere else that I know I want to live. So maybe we would kind of wander around for a while. And the whole idea of this heartbroken girl and her dad rambling around America, kind of running away from their heartache, came out of that daydream. And in fact, when I wrote the rough draft, I wanted to keep it in that place of truth, even though it's not true. And so I kept it all autobiographical. So the mom and the dad in the story were me and my wife's actual names. And the 3 girls in the story were my daughter's actual names. And all of Coyote's memories and flashbacks were like real things from my family. And so it was hard to write, even though it was all made up. It was kind of tragic, or totally tragic. And so when I finished it, I gave it to my wife to read. She's always my first reader. And she said, "Oh, I really like it, but you have to change all these details. It's just a book about our family dying," which I thought was fair. And so I went back and changed it all to make it all more ostensibly fictional. But that's where it came from. So even though it's not a true story, it kind of felt like a true story to me when I wrote it. And it came out of a true place of my heart.
So this character of Coyote/Ella, is that based on someone?
No. So she's definitely a work of fiction as well. Now, her real name, we find out at the end, is Ella. And that actually is my middle daughter's real name, because I changed it all. But then she said, well, he can keep my name, right? Because I'm the one that lives. And my wife agreed. And so that actually is my middle daughter's name. But the personality of that character is not based on my middle daughter or anyone I know. I'm a little different than some authors. A lot of authors, when they talk, they'll say, oh, this character is based on my childhood friend, or this character is based on my little sister, whatever. And I've never done that. All of the characters out of all of my books are all completely made up. I just kind of try to let the character come to me. What kind of character they feel like they would be or should be or could be? What would work best for the story? And how does the voice kind of come into my head? And Coyote really sprang forth fully formed. I didn't really work on her. I never had to sit there and say, oh, what would Coyote think? Or what would Coyote say in the situation? She was always ready to start talking. She had a big personality. She always had plenty to say. But she really is she was alive somewhere inside me, because she's not based on anyone that I know.
She is quite a unusual character.
She is. She's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Very willing to do stuff. I don't know what you call that. It has a lot of agency, like jumps right in and tries to fix things.
She does.
Yeah. In fact, I was wondering, is this really a 12-year-old? Seems like it might be more like a 14-year-old. I wonder what you thought about that.
It's tricky writing for a younger audience because your main character, you're always trying to thread the thin line of like realism and what's realistic, but what's also like dramatic and fun and exciting and interesting. And so you need a main character that has the chance to have like agency, like you said, to make choices, to make decisions, to make mistakes, because that's what a story is. A story is basically the main character's choices and the consequences of those choices, right? And it's tricky because so many 11, 12, 13-year-olds, they don't have the chance to make a million choices and decisions and mistakes because the grown-ups are always messing things up and their parents are always telling them what to do and their teachers are always telling them what to do. And so it's always tricky to make a character feel like they're actually 11 or 12 or 13, but still have them do the big dramatic things that you need for the story to happen. And sometimes you get on the wrong side of that line. It's like, oh boy, this kid seems awful, either whatever, confident or smart or wise for 12-year-olds, but you're trying to make the story work. And so, yeah, and so you're always trying to do the best you can to make a fully alive, exciting, exceptional kind of character that readers will love, but also one that'll hopefully feel real. And also, just like from a market perspective, it's kind of interesting is that there's certain kind of unwritten or written rules about ages of characters in books. Really, I mean, I've been told it all comes from Barnes & Noble, the big chain bookstore, because in my first couple books, in my rough drafts, my main character was 13. And my publisher maybe changed the main character to 12, and 13 or even 14 had felt more realistic to me, but they said, no, it has to be 12, because if the main character is 13 or over, Barnes & Noble puts that book on the YA shelf. And if they're under 13, it puts them in the children's section, the middle grade section. And so to make sure, and this is not a YA book, this is definitely a middle grade book. And so we need to make the character 12 so it gets on the right shelf in that bookstore. And so now I've written 5 books. And one of them, the main character is a dog, so that doesn't count. But of the 4 that have human main characters, they're all exactly 12 because they're all pushing it on how the character is going to act. So they're not going to be 11 or 10, but they're not allowed to be 13. And so, yep, they're all 12-year-old main characters for me.
Thing.
I wonder if you could like not disclose their age.
Well, now that you say that, I'm thinking like all these books that I've read recently have 12-year-old characters, or at least like if there's a sibling group, the oldest is 12 and then never go past. So
Right.
interesting.
And there's kind of a gap in the market because another rule unwritten is that younger readers like to read up. And so 11-year-olds want to read about 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds want to read about 16-year-olds. No one, 13-year-old does not want to read about a 10-year-old. And so you also age your characters at the top of your market. And so you don't find a lot of even 11-year-old main characters. There's mostly 12. And in YA, they're almost all 17 or 18. There's almost no books about 13, 14, or 15-year-olds. And some people bemoan that. Some parents, some teachers, some readers like, hey, I'm a 14-year-old. I want to read about a 14 or a 15-year-old. And I've either got to have pretty edgy upper high school stuff, or I've got to drop all the way down to 12 years old. So it's kind of weird how the market can drive things like that.
That is funny. So what about, do you have any experiences with driving school buses?
I do not. I tried to get an experience because when I started doing the research, I was like, okay, is this? I knew I'd seen a couple buses driving around that had been refurbished. I thought, so I knew it was a thing that's kind of done out there. And so I started looking into it, and it's a very active community that I've started to get a little involved with. They call themselves Schoolies, SKOOLIES, and they buy old school buses and they refurbish them. They drive around the country. There's a ton on Instagram. There's message boards. It's a whole big world out there I didn't know. But I looked into it, and you can buy old school buses like really affordably because, you know, there's thousands of districts all over the country that are getting rid of their fleets, you know, every few years. And who's going to buy them except, I mean, who's going to buy an old school bus? And so you can get like a, you know, 6 or 7 or whatever, 10-year-old school bus that's in great condition for like $8,000. I mean, less than you would pay for a car. And it's a big, huge school bus. And so I told my wife, oh, let's do this. Let's buy an old bus and it'll be like research for my book. And she was like, no, we're not going to do that. So, I mean, the short answer is no. I have no experience driving a bus, but I tried. I made an effort.
So what made you think of the school bus idea then?
Well, so I had the idea of a girl and her dad traveling around the country. And so then you just start thinking, I mean, so much of story writing or book writing is like, you hit decisions, you think about, you make decisions to make the story work. It's just, how can the story work? And some decisions you make for fun, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, and some choices you make for a specific reason, like, because you want an effect or you want whatever. And some are just random, like, why does the character have blue eyes and not brown eyes? I just chose blue, whatever. And the school bus was kind of a wouldn't it be fun category of choice. So, I mean, it could have been just in a van, that would have been fine. They could have been like in an RV, that would have been maybe more realistic. But as I was early stages of brainstorming, I thought, God, wouldn't it be kind of cool? Like just the imagery, just the feel of it. And, you know, her dad, Rodeo, is an eccentric kind of funky interesting character. It seemed like it fit his personality better. I liked it visually, and you're always looking for ways to hook a young reader's attention. And if you say a girl lives in an RV, okay, that's kind of interesting, but a girl lives in an old school bus, it's at least, I think, a little more interesting. And again, it fit the vibe and the atmosphere, and what I thought was kind of the flavor of the story. And so that was what I went with.
Cool. So,
Phyllis lived in a school bus, or when she was a kid, she traveled in a school bus.
I did. Yeah. I'm a veteran schooler, I guess. This was in the early 60s.
Wow. Awesome. That's super cool.
Yep. I remember we pulled up. So our school bus was not all that cool or nifty or anything like that, right? And so we were living in Texas, and we were driving this thing down near where they employ migrant workers. So the we stopped for gas, and the guy at the gas station offered my dad a job picking peaches.
Oh, nice.
And my dad actually was a professor.
Nice.
So my mother was having a cow, and my dad is just kind of stringing the guy along. Oh yeah, I got another job on down the road. I'm sorry, I won't be able to do this.
Nice.
Yeah, those were the times. So, have you had homeschoolers in particular talk about your book that you know of?
I know I have. So it's interesting to see. Well, anytime you get any feedback from a reader, it's interesting, because writing is kind of a weird, a medium, because you don't interact with the reader. Like if I was like a musician, I'd be on stage and I could see the audience. I could talk to them after the show or whatever. But like writing, you do it by yourself, and then you send it off. And then theoretically, somewhere out there, someone is sitting with your book by themselves reading it. And so you're not directly connected. And so anytime I get an email or whatever, a message through some channel, it's always really interesting and exciting to know that someone actually read those words that you wrote on your computer. And so it's always fun. And so it's also interesting to see different people that respond to different books, because I've got 5 different books out that all have a pretty different feel, pretty different kind of genre kind of thing. And so it's kind of cool to see who reaches out. And so with Coyote, yeah, I've gotten a lot of reaching out from the schoolie community, which has been really fun. And I've gotten some really cool postcards and stuff from families that live in school buses and drive around. They're like, wow, this is like a book kind of about how our family lives. So that's been interesting. And yeah, there have been some homeschooling reached out, because Coyote technically is homeschooled, right? She doesn't go to school, and her dad is in charge of her education. I don't think that he would pass a lot of standards as far as like instructional integrity necessarily, or academic preparedness, but she's getting an education of sorts, and certainly at home. And so I have gotten some messages from homeschoolers like, oh, this kind of resonates with what we do. And it's cool to see that. Cool to see that a story that you write kind of connecting in different ways with different groups of readers.
It's interesting, right? And how about goats? Are you familiar with goats?
I'm not familiar with goats. I did some research to find a breed that I thought looked cool, and so I named Gladys's breed in there. And the illustrator did a great job of putting her on the back of the book. But that, again, that's one of those. So much of writing for me, I think probably for most writers, definitely for me, so much is trial and error. And I get an idea like, maybe this happens. There she is. Maybe this happens. Maybe this happens next. And I put it down. I write it down. My rough drafts are very rough. And then I decide, do I like it or not? Does that work or not? And a lot of times I say nope, and I delete it, and I throw that chapter away and try again. And to me, that's not wasted time. That's me figuring out ways I don't want to go, and how should this story feel? And so the goat, I thought, like it popped into my head. There I was in the scene. I thought, what if there's a goat on the bus? And I thought I thought, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna give it a try. And I thought, I'm not gonna like this. It's a little over the top. It's possibly distracting. It's pushing the limits of believability, perhaps. But then I really loved how it felt. And it's not a big part of the book. It's the last couple chapters. The goat is not a main character. But I thought it was kind of nice wallpaper, kind of like the bus. It kind of added to the flavor of the story. It was funny enough without hopefully being distracting from the main kind of emotional arc. So yeah, that was me getting a crazy idea and then deciding I actually kind of liked it.
Yeah, I like it too.
Good.
What if you had a skunk?
I know. You could go lots of wrong directions with trying to incorporate non-traditional pets for sure.
Cool. Well, did you have any questions, Sarah?
I was kind of curious about how you chose where they stopped, like the descriptions of where they stopped along the way and stuff like that, or
Right. And some of those, and that took a lot of work and a lot of research is a strong word, but a lot of playing around like Google Maps. Some of it was just pure logistically driven. Like, okay, if they start in this town and they drive for 8 hours, where would they end up? So a lot of Google Maps, a lot of over and over again. And I kept having to change it because, oh, shoot, like, you know, this kind of needs to be a breakfast scene for whatever reason. So for them to get there at breakfast, that means you need to leave. I did so much adjusting of the time frame and even the places. A lot of the places that were in my rough drafts are no longer there anymore because it just didn't work. Like, oh, that's only 2 hours away from the next spot. That doesn't make any sense. And some of them, though, I put in for on purpose. So I kept stretching it out. Originally, I had them starting like in South Carolina, but then it turns out if you drive nonstop, it doesn't take that long to get from South Carolina to Washington State, like a day and a half or something. And so shoot. And so I kept bumping it further south. Ended up at the very southern tip of Florida, as far as I could go, besides Key West, as far south as I could go. And then I invented that whole jaunt to Michigan, which doesn't make any sense, except that it stretched out. It gave me another 13 hours of driving, so I could make the story last as long as I wanted to. And I also included Michigan. I love Michigan. I had just done a couple of different school visits to Michigan. Was very impressed with the people and kids and teachers and schools in Michigan. So I thought, oh, this will be fun. I'll give Michigan a shout out. It's a lot like Washington State where I live, and I felt very at home there. And then some of the places like this, there's a, without giving anything away, there's something that happens outside of Anaconda, Montana. That was on purpose because my mom's family is from Anaconda, Montana. So I've got roots in Anaconda. And so that was kind of a shout out there. And yeah, and then eventually it got back to logistics, like where are they going to be to make them, you know, get back to that park at about the right time? If they can't get there at midnight, they've got to get there in the morning. And so it's kind of just making the story work, but also I got to put in some of my own little personal shout outs as well.
Very good. So this book really is about grief. So have you written other books about grief?
You know, all of my books are journey stories. Not a single one of them happens like in the character's house, in the character's town even. They're all someone's heading somewhere or sent somewhere for some reason. But they're also all emotional stories. Like some stories are just plot and they're just fun, and that's great. I've got like James Bond movies. There's not a lot of emotion in a James Bond movie, but they're super fun. Everybody loves James Bond movies. But my books all definitely have a big emotional part that I would say is equally as important as the plot. The plot is hopefully interesting, hopefully exciting, but what the book is really, really about is more the inside stuff, right? And so let's see, books about grief. I guess there's certainly some grief in Good Dog. Up here, this is about a ghost dog. He's dead, but he's kind of, there's some grief involved in that. But then he realizes that the boy that he loves back here on Earth is in danger, and so he figures out how he can come back like as a ghost to try to save his boy. And so this one's got some kind of more of a personal grief, like he's having to make his peace and say goodbye and move on. So he's not grieving somebody else, but it's got some elements of loss and death. And my second book, right back here, Some Kind of Courage. This one is set kind of in the pioneer days of Washington State. So 1890 for us out here, a lot later than you guys in Missouri. And it's about a kid who is a pioneer kid. He's also an orphan. The rest of his family died on the journey west. And so he's trying to kind of figure out where he goes, where does he fit, how does he live? And that's not as much of what it's about. The grief part, him figuring out where he belongs is the main thing. But it's a lot about him trying to find this horse that he loves. But the grief is a constant heartbeat throughout. And every time he's in a stressful situation or a tense situation, he remembers either something his mom said or something his dad said, and he uses that as a guide for himself for making his own moral choices. And so grief is not the main idea, but it's a very strong idea in here, and it's definitely woven pretty palpably throughout.
I like the idea of journey stories rather than, because a 12-year-old is always going to be in school, but the school doesn't have to be like the main setting for every single book that has 12-year-old characters in it.
Right.
Which is, yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dan. And,
Yeah, thank you.
Enjoyed your book a lot.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reading. Thanks for inviting me on and hosting me on your channel. It was great to chat with you guys.
Yes, and if you're going to the library, if your library's open, or if you're going to reserve a book, don't forget The Remarkable Journey of Coyote Sunrise by Dan Gemeinhart.